Hello and welcome. Well, after writing about Tolkien, my mind turned to C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was influential in my remaining an Anglican when I gave my volitional assent to Jesus as a second-year undergraduate. I said to God, I think almost certainly Jesus is the living Word, the Saviour, the Logos, he whom I had met in a out of the body experience after I drunk myself to death a couple of years earlier. And so I'm going to follow him. I will give myself to you on provisionally converted for periods of 48 hours to make sure that it really is you. Meanwhile, what kind of Christian shall I become? I'd quite like it if you left it to me to be either a Catholic or a Pentecostal, because I think they both take you more seriously. And then, as so often is the case, after I prayed, I waited for an answer, and I was reading Screwtape Letters, and suddenly this phrase jumped out and battered my forehead for attention. And it was the advice of the senior devil to the junior devil to whatever happens, get your patient to change churches and be critical. And it seemed to me that God was saying, you must stay where you are. You're required to be an Anglican for the next 40 years, at any rate. So it was Lewis that made me an Anglican, but it was also Lewis in part who made me a Catholic, because I read in his writing things that were increasingly and obviously Catholic. I read about purgatory. I read about his extraordinary inner life in the fictional book Letters to Malcolm. I was astonished at the rich struggle he must have had with evil to have been able to write Screwtape. I realized that he believed in purgatory, having read what was to become one of my favorite books ever, The Great Divorce. The divorce, of course, referring to the divorce between heaven and hell, and his repudiation of Blake, who wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, with his Gnostic and what was to be Jungian overtones. So we've come to a moment where we're about to have they are about to have a new Archbishop of Canterbury. And it seems to me that this would be quite a useful moment to look at what Lewis thought about the issues of sex in ministry. Not everyone knows, but he wrote this extraordinary paper on priestesses. And I thought what I'd do is I'd begin with a couple of clips of the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, a short while ago, I was commenting on her, and I made comments on her appearance. And people thought that was petty and shallow and mean of me. It wasn't intended to be. What I intended to do was to say that appearance mattered. There was a certain amount of being as well as doing, particularly in an office of a bishop or an archbishop and even a priest. And that the being part was failed by the chief nurse of Great Britain. She didn't look like a priest or a bishop or an archbishop. And that was a problem. And it wasn't so much a critique of her haircut, though my sense of humor being really all very difficult to control. I did point out a similarity to the Dulux paint dog, but I'm sorry about that. I have a very alert sense of humor. But the reason for these two clips are, I think they offer some form of illustration of why Lewis was concerned. One of them is to do with her crying in the face of microaggressions, and the other is to do with a ghastly look on her face as she was asked to do something to defend children from the sexualization of the alphabet movement, and she smirks and stays silent. I'll say more about those, but let's just go to the clips very briefly.
Sam Marbury, Coventry 295. While not all pride is sexualised, there is evidence of sexual content. Sorry about this, that's never happened before. There is evidence of sexual content on our streets that would not be allowed on TV before 9 p.m. There is evidence of sexualisation and grooming of children at Pride. This is my question, Chair. There is evidence of sexualisation and grooming of children at some Pride events. What is the House of Bishops doing to protect children from that sexualisation at Pride or from queer theory? Thank you.
That does not relate to the question, the original question.
It does. It's about the Bishop's position on Pride, Chair, and whether they're protecting children from Pride. They should have a position and be able to tell me. Because you don't want to protect children and you dare not speak against Pride or queer theory. Shame on you.
Please sit down.
I would love to encourage women, which I do all the time, but there continues to be institutional barriers. We continue to experience microaggressions.
Feminism has wounded the churches, the Protestant churches, that is, beyond repair. The apostles were tough men who died for their faith. Interestingly, Jordan Peterson has said one of the real distinctions between men and women in psychological terms is that women manage to keep the peace better because they want to accommodate themselves. They like to be agreeable. And in a context where you have a culture which attacks Christianity, wanting to be agreeable becomes a very serious Achilles heel. Men are less inclined to be agreeable, so they're more willing to fight for what matters. Fight spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, argumentatively, intellectually, and, if they have to, physically. It's always been quite difficult to get men to believe because men have got a natural inclination to deal pragmatically with the situation in front of them, and their intuitions are not as developed as those of many women, particularly saintly women. But our present culture makes it impossible for men to identify with what we've just seen demonstrated, the culture that Anglicanism has immersed itself in, the complete emasculinization of gender, effectively, or sex. I want to read from Lewis's great essay on priestesses because I think we need to give him a clear run. But before I do, I want to talk about his Catholic mind. Lewis described himself as a medievalist. So one of the things we're going to look at during the course of this conversation is why he didn't become a Catholic and how nearly Catholic he wasn't, how he would have become a Catholic if Sarah Mullally had been appointed Archbishop to the Church of England during his lifetime. The reason for being a medievalist was that he had a great love of the medieval picture of the cosmos. He talked about it in terms of virtue, the cosmos, and order. But of course, by medieval, what he really means is Catholic. It's the Catholic mind. There is no Protestant mind in the Middle Ages. It hadn't emerged. So let him describe himself. So this is his inaugural lecture at Cambridge in 1954, the year I was born, in De Descriptione Temporum. He said, born in the closing years of the 19th century, I belong far more to that old Western culture than to the modern world. And modern in that sense is a technical word. The real change in human history occurred not within living memory. So he's thinking, I think, of the shift between the 19th and 20th century. But at the end of the Middle Ages, well, that's when the Reformation happened. He felt that modern people had crossed a civilizational frontier that left them unable to imagine what their ancestors meant by virtue, cosmos, or order, which is why I think the Anglican Church can't imagine what the cathedral is for, given that it emerged as a place to celebrate the Mass and all the Mass means. Difficult to make sense of it if you repudiate what the Mass means. In The Discarded Image in 1964, he called the medieval model of the universe a thing of exquisite beauty, describing it not as a childish superstition, but as a symphony of ordered power and love. What a fantastic phrase. A symphony of ordered power and love. He admired its coherence, the cosmos filled with meaning, hierarchy, and joy. We don't like any of those things today. We dislike meaning. We've become a postmodern non-truth society. We hate hierarchy. We want everything to be flat and egalitarianly the same. And we don't have much joy. In contrast with what he sees as isolation and flux of modernity. He once said that his faith and imagination were pre-Copernican in temper, and if he was ever to be carbon dated, it should be filled out about AD 1500. 20 years before Luther really got going. Lewis has an allegiance of the imagination with the Middle Ages, a sacramental universe where everything, matter and spirit, participates in divine meaning, rather than the mechanistic one where nothing does. So here he is on sex and the priesthood. See if I can bring him across a bit more. It is painful, writes Lewis, being a man, to have to assert the privilege or the burden which Christianity lays on my own sex. I am crushingly aware how inadequate most of us are in our actual and historical individualities to fill the place prepared for us. But it is an old saying in the army, you salute the uniform and you don't salute the wearer. Only one wearing the masculine uniform can, provisionally until the parousia, represent the Lord in the church, for we are all, corporately and individually, feminine to him. We men may often make very bad priests, but that is because we're insufficiently masculine. Just hang on to that a moment. That's really, that's like a time bomb in the mind. We men make bad priests sometimes because we're insufficiently masculine. It's no cure to call in those who are not masculine at all. A given man may make a very bad husband. You cannot mend matters by trying to reverse the roles. He may make a bad male partner in a dance. The cure for that is that men should more diligently attend dancing classes, not that the ballroom should henceforth ignore distinctions of sex and treat all dancers as neuter. Going on, there's a gap of text in there, but getting on to the passages I think are critical. What then except prejudice begotten by tradition forbids us to draw on the huge reserves which would pour into the priesthood if women were here, as in so many other professions, put on the same footing as men? Well, they have been, and you've seen what's happened. And against this flood of common sense, the opposers, many of them women, can produce at first nothing but an articulate distaste or a sense of discomfort when they find, which they themselves find hard to analyze. Indeed, that's where it began for most of us. There's something wrong here, but I can't put my finger on it. All the opponents of my view want fairness and practicality. Who can be against fairness and practicality? Unless there is a subtle argument that lies deeper than the surface of things, which is what Lewis says is the case. That this reaction does not spring from any contempt from women, I think, is plain from history. The Middle Ages carried their reverence for one woman to a point at which the charge could plausibly be made that the Blessed Virgin became, in their eyes, almost the fourth person of the Trinity. So it's not misogyny then. But never, as far as I know, in all those ages was anything remotely resembling a sacerdotal, a priestly office attributed to her. All salvation depends on the decision which she made. Ecce ancilla, behold. Intimacy with the Eternal Word, the foot of the cross. It aside by saying that local and temporary conditions contend. One man had 4 daughters who prophesied, i.e. preached. There were prophetesses even in Old Testament times. Prophetesses, yes, not priestesses. Montanism in the 2nd and 3rd centuries tried to bring in priestesses with prophetesses, and the church rejected it as being very dangerous. At this point, Lewis goes on, the common sensible reformer is apt to ask why, if women can preach, they can't do all the rest of a priest's work? This question deepens the discomfort from my side, says Lewis. We begin to feel that what really divides us from our opponents is a difference between the meaning of what they and we give to the word priest. It's all down to definitions, which often don't get explored. Back to Lewis again. The more they speak, and speak truly, about the competence of women in administration, their tact and sympathy as advisors, their national talent for visiting, the more we feel the central thing is being forgotten. To us, a priest is primarily a representative, a double representative, who represents us to God, but, this is the bit that gets forgotten, God to us. Our very eye, church, sometimes a priest turns his back on us and faces the east. He speaks to God for us. Sometimes he faces us and speaks to us for God. We have no objection to a woman doing the first. The whole difficulty is about the second, the woman representing God. But why? Why should a woman not, in this sense, represent God? Certainly not because she's necessarily, or even probably, less holy, or less charitable, or stupider than a man. In that sense, she may be as godlike as any man, and a given woman may be much more so than a given man. Many of us know women who are much more so than us. The sense in which she cannot represent God will perhaps be plainer if we look at the thing the other way round. Suppose the reformer stops saying that a good woman may be like God and begins by saying that God is like a good woman. Suppose he says we might just as well pray to our mother who art in heaven as our Father. Suppose he suggests the incarnation might just as well have taken a female as a male form, and the second person of the Trinity be as well called the daughter as the Son. Suppose finally the mystical marriage were reversed, that the church were the bridegroom and Christ the bride. All this, it seems to me, is involved in the claim a woman can represent God as a priest does. Now, it is surely the case that if these supposals were ever carried into effect, we should have embarked on a different religion. Goddesses have of course, been worshipped, and many religions have had priestesses, but they are religions quite different in character from Christianity. Common sense, disregarding the discomfort or even the horror which the idea of turning all our theological language into the feminine gender arouses in most Christians, will ask, why not? Since God is not, in fact, a biological being and he has no sex, what can it matter whether we say he or she, father or mother, son or daughter? Well, that's the argument that's been prevailed over the last 70 years. But Christians think that God himself has taught us how to speak of him. This is the God's personal preferred pronouns argument. To say that it does not matter is to say either that all inspired is quite arbitrary and unessential. And this is surely intolerable, or if it is tolerable, it's an argument not in favor of Christian priestesses, but an argument against the whole integrity of Christianity. It's also surely based on a shallow view of imagery. Without drawing upon religion, we know from our poetical experience that our image and apprehension cleave closer together than common sense is prepared to admit. That a child who has been taught to pray to a mother in heaven would have a religious life radically different from that of a Christian child. And as image and apprehension are in an organic unity, so for a Christian are human body and human soul. The innovators are trying to imply that sex is something superficial, irrelevant to the spiritual life. To say that men and women are equally eligible for a certain profession is to say that for the purposes of that profession, their sex is irrelevant. We are, within that context, treating both as neuters. You'll realize, I think, immediately too, that the only way in which the incarnation can bind men and women together is if the God-bearer is a woman. If the Messiah was a woman too, you would have a woman Theotokos, a woman Saviour, and it would be very hard to persuade ourselves that the Creator was not woman as well. So it's only in the present economy of the way sex is used that we can have in fact, a Holy Trinity that binds together all of us, if and so long as you include Our Lady. as I think quite rightly you should, co-redemptrix. That means she was profoundly involved in the economy of our salvation as the second Eve, because her yes made it all possible. It couldn't have happened without her yes and her carrying the yes through. I think Lewis would look at the election of Sarah Mullally and say, this is not a church I can be part of. Indeed, this is not a Christian church anymore. It's got too many confusions at the root of it. And part of the problem is that feminism has brought with it that whole devotion to relativity, to this distaste for the absolute. And I'm afraid for ultimately some form of syncretism where, in order to be agreeable, the church just lies down and tries to accommodate other beliefs to keep a quiet life. This is not how Christianity survived. It's not how it triumphed. If you hand it over to agreeable relativistic women, it will change its character completely. What about Lewis and Catholicism? I think one of the first things we have to say, which Joseph Pierce says in his great book about it, is that Lewis was born in Ulster. As you know, Ulster is the place of civil war between the Scots-Irish and the Irish-Irish. And it's hard to underestimate the level of prejudice and distaste that the Ulster Irish had for the Catholics. There's a wonderful quote, which I'm rather hoping I might be able to find, from his 9-year-old diary. So Lewis wrote this as a 9-year-old. We were obliged to go to St. John's, a church which wanted to be Roman Catholic, but was afraid to say so. In this abominable place of Romish hypocrites and English liars, the people cross themselves, bow to the Lord's table, and pray to the Virgin. This was 9-year-old Lewis' experience of Anglo-Catholicism. He didn't like it. He didn't respect it. But like Charlie Kirk, Lewis found himself moving closer and closer to Catholicism, partly by temperament, partly by theology, partly by clarity of thought. His book, The Great Divorce, is an extraordinary exploration of purgatory, and very beautiful and wonderful too. And if you haven't read it, it's worth every moment it takes to read it. The characters at the end are all types, archetypes in fact, with archetypical temptations. And the invitation always to make that extra sacrifice which will allow them into the presence of the living, pure and holy God. Or, if they choose, because we have this gift of free will that either results in our divinization or in our damnation, sent back to purgatory. Purgatory is not hell, of course. It's a place where you wait, a refrigerium, I think Dante called it. So we have this extraordinary sense of purgatory, which is very un-Protestant. He began to describe the Eucharist as the Mass. He treated his vicar as though he was a Catholic priest and made his confession to him in Oxford. Talks about the Mass, makes his confession, believes in the sacraments, it seems, increasingly, and has an outlook on life that is very close to being Catholic theologically, and partly because of his medieval worldview. But he believed in the Church of England. He believed that, both for principal reasons and for practical reasons, that the Church of England could come good, might come good. What would have happened if he discovered, as I discovered in my lifetime, that so far from coming good, the Church of England went bad? It leaves you with no refuge. Ultimately, the experiment of the Reformation is over, and it seemed to have failed. The promise that people could build the church and find their own way by reading the Bible on their own terms fails. Scott Hahn has this wonderful small video vignette where he talks about how the early church was built around the Mass and not around the Bible. He says that Jesus only uses the word New Testament once, I think in Luke 22, and then St. Paul uses it once. And they both mean the Eucharist. Do this in remembrance of me. Jesus didn't say, write this. He said, do this. Of the 12 apostles, very few of them wrote anything. They all did the Eucharist. They did the Mass. The early church wrote the Bible as a liturgical handbook to accompany the thing Jesus told them to do, the experience of his body and blood in the New Testament, in the New Covenant. In other words, Scott Hahn says, for the first 300 years, because there was no canon, there was no agreed Bible until about the year 380, the Council of Carthage. There was, in fact, an agreed Eucharist. The Didache describes it. The early liturgies describe it. So before the Bible came the Mass, and the Bible was written to accompany the Mass as a form of liturgical textbook. History means that the church that Jesus left behind him was the Catholic Church. The Protestant Church was an innovation that took place 1,500 years later in an attempt to try and put right what the reformers in Europe thought had gone wrong. The problem was they were profoundly compromised, psychologically in Luther's case, politically in Calvin's case, philosophically in Zwingli's case. So, would St. Louis be a Catholic today? Absolutely. He had problems about the papacy, but I think these were largely inherited from his Ulster youth. Because, again, most people believe that the Catholic claims about the papacy are, rather what they believe about them don't bear much resemblance to what Catholics do believe. The Pope is not a monarch in that sense. He's not an absolute authority. There have only been 2 cases in the whole of history where he's believed to have spoken with some degree of proper inspiration. And so the things that people are afraid of, just as Chesterton said, there are so many reasons for being afraid of Catholicism, but very few of them have anything to do with what it really is. The reason I think this is worth saying now is not just because Lewis was profoundly influenced by J.R.R. Tolkien, who was Catholic. He was also influenced by Charles Williams, who was very high church Anglican. But because the Church of England's changed, it's given way to the weaknesses that were implicit in the Protestant idea. And before a very dangerous and very anti-Christian culture, it's submitted and rolled over. And I think the problem with the election of Sarah Mullally is it shows us what the consequences of that subjugation are. They are a form of surrender, of being willing to go along with what the enemy tells you should think, of not being faithful to Jesus' words and ethics in the Gospels or Christian tradition. And so who is left to fight the culture wars? Only the Catholic Church, some blessed evangelicals, some blessed Pentecostals. But these are groups which come and go, which renewed and decay according to the cycle of the seasons. But the Catholic Church, although it experiences the depths of the culture war, has been very badly wounded, has occasionally been very badly behaved, nonetheless is bound by the magisterium, the mind of the Holy Spirit, working on it over 2,000 years, and has kept the faith. It has not and will not give way to the demands of our present culture. And that's one of the reasons why so many of us have decided we have to leave the platform that was sinking beneath our feet and capitulating year by year and join the church that Jesus founded. God bless you. Pray for me as I pray for you as we continue on our journey.